Welcome to the Bible Journey Midweek Connect. My name is Mark Green. I'm a pastor here at Otterbine Church. Thanks for joining us on this great journey. Today we're coming to the last section of 2 Corinthians. So far, in chapters 1 through 7, reconciliation has occurred. And in chapter 7, we got this beautiful model of how to reconcile with fellow believers. Then Paul encouraged the Corinthians to fulfill their financial obligation to the Jerusalem church. And we got this another wonderful picture of how financial generosity is actually a metaphor for the grace of God given to us in salvation. And Paul encourages them through the gospel to reconcile, and he encourages them through the gospel to honor their financial commitment to the Jerusalem church. In chapters 10 through 13, Paul brings this to a close, and there seems to have been, while reconciliation had occurred in the church, there were still a few people who didn't get on board with that. Isn't that always the case? There's always a few holdouts. So Paul now turns his attention to them. It seems that the main source of the conflict with these holdouts was there had been some very impressive leaders show up in the town and start teaching, and they were elevating themselves above Paul and the apostles. In chapter 11, verse 5, Paul says, somewhat sarcastically, that he refers to them as super apostles. These are super apostles, and they're better than everyone else, or so they claim. These men had come to Corinth promoting themselves, and in the process of promoting themselves, part of the way they did that was by bad-mouthing Paul. Paul was just a poor, unsuccessful, uncool speaker. He didn't really have all the eloquency that they did, and they're going, how can you follow this guy? At the risk of sounding self-promoting, Paul says that these guys want to compare credentials. He is ready to play. And we're going to get some sarcasm from Paul in these chapters, because it's like, you want to brag? I'll play. So Paul begins in chapter 10 by pointing out that this is not an issue of who's better dressed or who the better speaker is or who had the better job. This is a spiritual battle. So Paul says, I'm not going to compare notes on a physical level. I want to compare notes on a spiritual level, and I'm going to win because the battle is spiritual, and I'm relying on the resources of God, not on my own personal abilities. Listen to how he says this. For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. What are those? We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your disobedience is complete. You hear what Paul's saying is, hey, this is not a battle of the flesh. I'm relying on the spiritual resources to fight this battle. And those spiritual resources allow me to tear down the strongholds of your arguments. Paul next admonishes the Corinthians to look beyond the surface. You see, when you live a superficial spiritual life, you are easily deceived. And the Corinthians were becoming infatuated with these super apostles because they weren't looking below the surface, and therefore they were being taken advantage of. And Paul's response is, hey, it has become necessary for me to point out some very specific things about these super apostles and about this process that is going to hurt a little bit. I am not doing this to lord this over you, Paul says, but I'm doing this to help you see the truth. He has been accused of writing heavy and bold letters while he himself is not very imposing, at least physically. And Paul's response, that may be true. I may not be the most physically imposing apostle, but when I show up, you're going to find out that the power of God in me is more than adequate to deal with this situation. You're going to discover that my letters are weighty, but I have the power of God to back them up. Don't you love that? These guys over here talking eloquently and elevating themselves, and Paul says, hey, I'm going to show up in the power of God. You're going to find out who's really the most powerful. Paul gives them 3 standards by which he will measure himself against the false apostles. First, in verse 12, the false apostles were measuring themselves against one another. Paul suggests another standard. let's measure ourselves against Christ. Verses 13 and 14, he offers a second standard. Who commissioned you to be an apostle to the Gentiles? He's asking them, who gave you your commission? Paul's saying, God commissioned me, and the proof of that is the church itself. And the final standard, in verses 15 and 16, is that the false apostles were way overemphasizing their impact. They were claiming such grandiose success, and Paul says, hey, you didn't birth this church, nor did you have any commission by God. The church is the work of God through me, and that's all. I just won't leave it there. What can you say to that? And the conclusion, verse 17, let the one who boast, boast in the Lord. For it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. Hey, false apostles, hey, super apostles, you can laud yourself all you want, but what really matters is who God commends. If you want to boast, boast in the Lord. If you want to brag on yourself, it's obvious that you are not from the Lord. Wow. Let's just pause for a moment. Did you notice how God-centric Paul's response to these super apostles was? Paul treats this as a spiritual battle that requires a spiritual solution. So his answers to their accusations rise above the superficial level of fancy speech and nice clothes and good jobs to spiritual warfare and spiritual results. Men and women, we need to learn from that. It's the same path when we have conflict. We need to rise above the superficial and embrace the spiritual and brag not on ourselves but on the person and work of Christ. We need to get the conversation out of the present fleshly world and into the world of Christ. Now, based on the way chapter 10 ends, chapter 11 is actually a bit of a surprise. Paul has condemned his opponents for superficial self-praise and warned the Corinthians not to be taken in by him. Now he turns the table and he says to his opponents, hey, it's time to boast a little. But unlike the super apostles, Paul is not boasting for personal gain, but Paul is boasting in order to win the hearts of the Corinthians. So listen to how he does this. In verses 2 to 6, Paul gives 3 grounds for his appeal to the Corinthians to bear with him. 2 are introduced by the word for in verses 2 and 4, and the final reason is in verse 5. Altogether, Paul is expressing a divine spiritual jealousy for them as a husband feels for his wife. He is concerned for their minds that they're not believing the truth, and their affections that they don't have devotion to Christ and him, and that they have turned to another. So he is affirming to them, I am devoted to you, and I am devoted to Christ, and I am inviting you to be devoted with me in those things. In verses 7 to 15, Paul needs to address with these supposed super apostles the issue of being paid. They're accusing him because he needs to be paid that or because he's not being paid, that he's really not an apostle. The super apostles are arguing that to be paid for their teaching is actually evidence that you're a real apostle. Paul had refused payments, but he had accepted gifts from other churches. So what they're accusing him of is, hey, you accepted payment from other churches, but not from the Corinthian church. Therefore, you're not a real apostle. And Paul's response is simple and clear. My refusal to be paid by you, even though I had a right, is evidence of my love for you and my desire not to be a burden. I didn't accept payment because I didn't want to be a burden to you. That way, Paul says, I could focus on presenting the gospel without being accused of peddling Christ for personal gain. In other words, Paul says, I'm going to choose the higher character standard that the false apostles did not grasp. They wanted to be paid as proof of their apostleship and value. Paul is saying, I love you so much that I'm going to reject payment in order that we can focus on Christ and the gospel. And then Paul ups the ante a little bit. The false apostles are not only deceitful impostors, but their deceit is evident that they are following the deceiver, Satan. Wow. Don't be surprised, Paul says, when deceivers deceive, it's because that's what their master does. From here, Paul returns to the theme of verses 1 through 6, that boasting in anyone other than Christ is foolishness. And in verses 16 through 20, Paul becomes a little sarcastic. Hey, false apostles, if you want to boast in the flesh, I'll play that game. You want to compare notes of fleshly benefits and skills? I'll play that game, and you know what? I'm going to win hands down. I will be a fool with you for a moment. As fellow fools, let's compare fleshly resumes. And then Paul goes on this rant about his heritage, his training, and his suffering. And I love verse 23. Since we're all acting like fools, let me just say, I am talking like a madman. A whole conversation, Paul says, is utterly ridiculous. To finish up this foolish contest, Paul hits the pause button on human flesh, on human boasting, and does a typical Paul thing. He makes it all about God and Jesus. Hey guys, you want to play the boasting flesh game? I win that. But I don't care about that. It's silly that we're even doing this. We're all acting like a bunch of madmen. Verse 30 and 31, here's what we really ought to be doing. If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. If I'm going to boast, I'm going to boast that I am weak so the power of God might be evidenced through me. You're boasting in all the things that you're capable of doing, willing to do, and your greatness because you're relying on yourself. I'm going to make this about Jesus, and I'm going to celebrate my weakness so that the power of God can be evidenced through me. A great lesson for us all. May you find great joy in your journey of reading the Bible.